On the morning of May 22, 1453, a lunar eclipse moved over Constantinople. The moon dimmed, turned a dull copper, and then disappeared behind cloud. For the defenders inside the walls, it felt like confirmation of something they already feared. There was an old Byzantine prophecy that the city would never fall while the moon was full. The moon had just failed them on schedule. This was the 6th week of the Ottoman siege, and the city had roughly 7,000 men to defend it. Mehmed II had somewhere between 60 and 80,000 soldiers camped outside. Depending on which account you use, the walls that had held for 1,000 years were cracking in specific places, patched with rubble and barrels of earth. Inside, the population had collapsed from what may have been hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000, maybe fewer. Plague, poverty, and a century of slow imperial decline had done most of the work before Mehmed arrived. What remained in May 1453 was a city that still looked like an empire from certain angles, and almost nothing from others. The Hagia Sophia still stood, still functioned, still drew people in for prayer. The great land walls still ran unbroken for nearly 4 miles from the Golden Horn down to the Marmara Sea. But behind them, large sections of the city were effectively empty, gardens growing wild where neighborhoods used to be. The emperor, Constantinos XI Palaiologos, had been asking the West for help since before the siege began. He had written to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to the King of Hungary. The responses were complicated, conditional, delayed, or quietly ignored. Venice did send ships eventually, but they arrived too late to change anything. The Genoese colony Eccelata, just across the Golden Horn, was officially neutral, which in practice meant watching very carefully. A Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo had come voluntarily with about 700 men, and he was now commanding the land wall defense. He was, by most accounts, the most capable military mind inside the city during those final weeks. Constantinos trusted him with the most exposed section of the wall, the Mesoteichion, where Mehmed's cannons had been aimed longest. Mehmed's great cannon, designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, had been firing since April. It could only fire about 7 times a day before it needed to cool, but each shot moved stone. The wall at the Mesoteichion was repaired every night and struck again every morning. The defenders had learned to hang bales of leather and wool over the damaged sections to absorb some of the impact. It helped, but not enough. By the last week of May, the breach was widening faster than it could be filled. On May 23rd, a Venetian ship returned to the harbor with news that no relief fleet was coming from the west. The captain had sailed as far as the Aegean searching for the promised Venetian armada. There was no armada. He brought that information back across the chain that guarded the Golden Horn and delivered it to the emperor. What Constantinos said in response, if he said anything recorded, does not survive clearly in the sources. What he did was continue organizing the defense. There were councils held in those final days, and some of the men in the room argued for negotiation. Mehmed had offered terms earlier in the siege. The emperor could leave with his life and his household. The city would be spared. Constantinos rejected it, and the sources suggest he rejected it more than once. Whether that was conviction, honor, calculation, or the weight of what it meant to be the last Roman emperor, historians still read it differently. The ordinary population of the city had no real say in any of this. Greeks, Italians, Jews, Armenians, and others lived inside those walls, going about what normal life still looked like under siege conditions. Markets still operated in some quarters at reduced scale. Churches were full. The mood, if the later accounts are accurate, moved between defiant prayer and quiet terror depending on the day. On the night of May 25th, Mehmed called his commanders together. He had been planning the final assault for several days and was now setting the timing. The attack would come before dawn on May 29th. It would begin with the irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks, sent in first against the weakened wall sections. They were expendable in the Ottoman tactical logic of the time, useful for exhausting the defenders before the elite janissaries were committed. Mehmed also addressed his troops directly in the days before the assault. He promised them 3 days of plunder, the traditional reward for a city taken by force. That promise was both a military incentive and a statement about what was coming. Inside the city, Constantinos held what would be his last formal gathering. He spoke to his commanders, his Genoese allies, his Venetian residents, and representatives of the Greek population. The speech, as recorded by later chroniclers, acknowledged that the situation was likely beyond recovery. He asked them to fight regardless. Some of those present, according to later accounts, wept. On the evening of May 28th, a long procession moved through the streets of Constantinople. Icons were carried from church to church, and a great liturgy was held inside the Hagia Sophia. Constantinos attended. Latin Christians and Greek Orthodox prayed together in the same space, which was itself historically unusual, a sign of how little the theological disputes of recent decades seemed to matter now. After the liturgy, Constantinos rode along the land walls one final time. He stopped at certain sections, spoke to the men stationed there, and then returned to the Blachernae Palace. What he did through the remaining hours of that night is not recorded in detail. By midnight, the Ottoman camp had gone quiet in a way that the defenders apparently noticed. The drums and the noise that had run for weeks stopped, and that silence was its own kind of signal. The first Ottoman wave hit the walls sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning on May 29th. The Bashi bazooks came forward in the dark against the damaged section of the Mesoteichion. Giustiniani and his men held them, but it cost time and energy the defenders could not easily replace. The second wave came from Anatolian troops, better organized, and they pushed harder against the same breach. Still the walls held, barely, for nearly 2 hours after the first contact. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in the entire siege. Giustiniani was wounded during the fighting. The exact nature of the wound is unclear across different sources. He asked Constantinos for the key to a small gate in the inner wall so he could be carried to the rear. Constantinos, according to several accounts, pleaded with him to stay. Giustiniani left anyway, and his Genoese troops, seeing their commander carried off, began to lose cohesion. Whether the wound was severe or whether Giustiniani simply broke under the pressure, later writers argued about for decades. What is agreed is that his departure created a gap in command at the worst possible moment. The Janissaries came forward in the third wave, fresh and organized, directly into that gap. A small postern gate, called the Kirkoporta, had been left open, possibly by accident, possibly by the chaos of the retreat. Ottoman soldiers pushed through it into the space between the inner and outer walls. The defenders on the wall above saw Ottoman flags rising inside the city before the wall itself had been taken. That image, flags appearing where they should not be, broke the defense faster than the cannon had. Men began pulling back from their positions along the wall. Constantinos, according to the sources that describe his final moments, threw off his imperial insignia. He rode toward the breach with a small group and disappeared into the fighting. His body was never definitively identified. Some accounts say he died at the gate fighting on foot, stripped of his markings so no one could single him out. Others are less certain. The Ottomans searched for him afterward, and Mehmed reportedly wanted confirmation, but what was brought back as identification was disputed even at the time. By sunrise on May 29th, Ottoman troops were moving through Constantinople's streets. The promised 3 days of plunder began, though Mehmed cut it short after the first day according to most accounts. He entered the city later that same morning, riding to the Hagia Sophia. He reportedly dismounted at the door, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his turban. The gesture, if it happened as described, was one of deliberate humility before God at the moment of his greatest victory. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the Christian altar was cleared and the first Muslim prayers were performed that afternoon. The building that had stood as a cathedral for nearly 1,000 years changed its function within hours of the city falling. Mehmed would later walk through the empty imperial palaces and reportedly quoted a Persian verse about dust and spiders inheriting the halls of kings. Whether he actually said it, or whether later writers gave him the right words, the image captured something real about what Constantinople had become. The city he took was not the city that had defined Byzantine power 5 centuries earlier. It was already a diminished place, governing almost nothing beyond its own walls. What fell on May 29th was less an empire in operation and more the idea of one. That distinction matters, because the standard framing of 1453 as a sudden civilizational break is not quite accurate. The Eastern Roman Empire had been losing territory, revenue, population, and political relevance for well over a century before Mehmed was born. What 1453 ended was the last physical address of a continuity that had been functionally dissolving for generations. That does not make it a minor event. It was not the fall closed a trading and administrative corridor that had connected Europe to the East for centuries. It sent scholars, manuscripts, and craftsmen westward into Italy and beyond, contributing to currents already moving through European intellectual life. It gave the Ottoman Empire a capital city of enormous symbolic and geographic weight, and it removed the last functioning claim to Roman imperial succession from the map. What people usually miss is how long the city had been living on borrowed time before that final week. The walls held, the liturgy was sung, the emperor stayed, and the flag still flew above the Blachernae Palace until the morning of the 29th. But the resources, the population, the alliances, and the strategic position had been eroding for so long that the siege itself was almost a formality. Mehmed did not break an empire. He closed one. As with much of this period, the details shift depending on the source, whether Byzantine, Ottoman, Venetian, or written years after the fact, and not every account agrees on the same sequence or meaning. What they do agree on is that by the morning of May 29, 1453, the city that called itself the Second Rome had become something else entirely.